At the beginning of this project, I had a phone call with Sophia. It was quite a chaotic, confusing conversation, but it was full of energy, and I was quite excited to start the journey of this project. I'm not a live artist, but I am an artist who deals with creativity in the everyday, and I explore a sense of belonging to people, family and community. The original brief of Sophia's had words such as small stories, memory and documentation, so the idea of working with archival footage and witnesses' recollections of this past performance was really exciting to me. My first instinct was to go and visit Anne in London and listen to her story personally. When I visited Anne in London, we decided that we would sort of chat informally and it would be videoed. And as I was sitting on the train, I felt like I was sort of Louis Theroux at the beginning of a weird weekend. I had no idea what to expect. I hadn't received Sophia's sort of recollections, the audio recordings, so I was taking a real leap of faith. When I was there, I investigated Anne as I would do anything. I sort of photographed her and her sort of domestic surroundings, feeling like sort of essence of her would be resonated in her belongings, and I wanted to sort of draw her close to myself, feeling that she was maybe sort of held this memory of this past performance. Anne described the performance paintings as exploring her previous work as an artist doing painting and sculpture, and the idea of this blank canvas staring back at you in quite a strange experience of beginning to paint, and that often at the end of the journey it didn't really reflect all of the energy and experience that had gone into it, and this inspired her to do this sort of spontaneous paintings performance. Another sort of important sort of idea was that she'd invited Rob Lafreniere, the writer of Performance magazine, and he was spontaneously typing up the interaction she did with the paintings and the audience as it happened in real time. So real kind of spontaneous communication between both of them, and she had the right to reply to him as an art commentator, and both their experience kind of, it was sort of symbiotic. So obviously I know that you did this at the Lang Gallery.
Yes.
But how did it come about? I mean, did you do these paintings in front of people? Was it a live painting performance?
Yes, it was a live painting performance. I had. I got from the Lane or Lang all their old proper frames, you know, the gold frames, all sorts of beautiful frames.
Yeah.
And I just hung them up as a completely empty exhibition of beautiful gold frames with white. So people walked in, and there were maybe 8, I can't actually remember, paintings all around the wall. And each
just pure white,
just pure white in gold frames. And then there was a big setup of different kind of paints and brushes and different medium. And whereby I had some idea of how I wanted to go about it, I was also very aware that I wanted it to shift, A, by the audience, but B, and I don't know if Sophia's spoken to you about Rob Lafreniere, who was involved.
A little bit about how she said that it was quite funny because you'd forgotten he was part of it. Yeah. But then you did remember, because he said, no, I was with this and I was typing. Is that right?
Yes, that's
he was
right.
Typing what you were doing as you were doing it. Is that true?
That's right. Well, I remembered always that I'd done this performance with Rob because it had been quite significant to me. But I didn't remember that it was this particular incarnation.
So you didn't remember him?
No, I completely remembered the piece. But I didn't remember it being there. And what I wanted, Rob was the editor of Performance magazine at the time. And I was very interested in the fact that, you know, there's a huge power, particularly in such a small world, where the only place you're probably ever going to appear, if you're ever written about it all, is in this magazine.
Yeah.
So it's a huge power of some kind of feedback and some kind of acknowledgement or lack of acknowledgement that I know for certain people shifted certain ways of looking at things.
Afterwards, I thought about sort of Anne's personality and her character. She had a real warmth and energy to her, and absolute sort of lack of pretension. I was really inspired by her, but I didn't feel so close to the actual performance. It felt like it was a really intense sort of one-off performance at the Lang, and I didn't feel close to it listening to the sort of recollections. Anne also was quite sort of baffled to maybe what my response would be as an artist, but we both sort of laughed about it and enjoyed our conversation, and were both really open to this journey. When I was in London, I met up with Edwina, my aunt, and her husband David. We sat outside her apartment and had a glass of wine, and she said to me, "What is your emotional response?" I kind of relayed with enthusiasm the idea of Rob Lafreniere typing up the performance as it happened, really spontaneously, and this sort of symbiotic relationship that Anne described between artist and commentator. And Rob had described this as maybe twittering or blogging, both of which are social networking sites where you communicate spontaneously what you're doing with your community. We really thought we were onto a winner of this, and we thought, well, that's it, Twitter will be a brilliant response to this project, that I could put out a Twitter about the painting's performance, and that any spontaneous feedback that came back would be the art. Misunderstanding Twitter at the time, as we both didn't quite get it, that actually it's more about people following your comments rather than responding to them, but at the time we thought we were onto a winner. Excited to have the beginning of a response to this performance, I still had a niggling feeling that I was slightly out of my depth in this experience. So I returned to the exhibition leaflet where Sophia had said, that it all made sense in this paragraph, and I reread it when I was there. It said, "Notes on a Return is an in-process redefinition of the documentation of ephemeral artworks. This redefinition foregrounds social, historical and political context and places an emphasis on the notion of an equal ownership shared between the artist and the viewer." I just thought, oh God, I actually don't really get it. My art is all about belonging, and I didn't really feel like I belonged to commenting on sort of politics of 1980s performance art. But, I didn't want to wimp out of the experience, and I felt like I, still remain really positive and really open. And anyway, this night we were off to see a very different performance. We were off to see the lip-syncing drag queens. As I sat there during the performance, I was mesmerised by the drag queens and a little bit in love with them, and I started to think about performance art and wondered how I'd got into this situation of responding to a performance that I'd never seen. As the sort of drag queens were sort of serenading me with Dolly Parton's songs, I thought about their creative performances, and actually most of all I thought about my grandmother. She, my sort of artistic muse, a huge inspiration for my own artwork, and probably the reason I felt like I belonged more to the drag queens at this point than I did with the project that I was battling with. Not even wanting to let this experience disappear, as I was photographing the drag queen's performance, I wondered how I was going to sort of deal with responding to a performance that had almost vanished. The next day went to the Picasso exhibition that was fittingly titled Picasso Challenging the Past. Not that I was any Picasso, but I thought he could help me out. Picasso pitted himself against the great master artists, taking on inspiration from their style but turning it into something entirely different. It was really great. There was a portrait of Van Gogh looking like the sort of angsty artist in his sun hat, and Picasso had sort of mirrored this in his own self-portrait in the sun hat, but had added him in sort of licking a tasty ice cream, sort of insinuating that even serious artists can take a break at some point. I really wondered and hoped whether I could be the ice cream to this project. The Picasso exhibition inspired me to do a portrait of Anne and myself. While I was with Anne, she'd let me photograph her in her studio, reading her book, Susan Sontag, regarding the pain of others. Mocking myself, I photographed myself reading OK magazine. I felt at this stage far from a sort of stereotypical artist. I'd left London, was residing in my hometown of Vegas, as we locals call it, for its less than glitzy energy. And even though I was embarking on a project about sort of spontaneous communication, I couldn't even afford internet in my flat and was madly rushing between the office and my flat to even send email. So I felt very much like the everyday office girl, taking a break and keeping up on local celebrities. Realising that the Twitter angle wasn't going to work because you needed to have an established community to receive your tweet, I started to think about another social networking site, Facebook, one that my friends and I use daily. I set up an art group on there using the image of Anne and myself, and I uploaded the video of our conversation. And I played with the idea how sort of documentation is read. On the video, I titled it Artists in Conversation, Meg Mosley and Anne Bean, even though really our chat had been informal and we were having Spanish omelette and tea. So I shared the video and all the photographs I've taken of Anne with my Facebook community. I was hoping that Facebook would act as a metaphor for the painting's performance. So the artist being Anne and the sort of spontaneous communication, the audience being the Facebook community, and the commentator, like Rob Lafrene was, would be me. I also set up a topic forum on there, looking into asking people how they express themselves on these social networking sites or sort of exhibit themselves. This keyed into the idea of something Anne talked about, of us all being consumers of our own experiences in this sort of very media age today, and that Facebook was kind of like self-cannibalism that Anne had said, which I really liked. People responded and made comments to Anne's video. They liked the sort of understanding of Anne talking about how a painting didn't really represent the whole journey and energy that was put into it. And one friend made a comment that she felt very much like that about her profile on Facebook, really not representing her whole identity. I took this further and looked into sort of social media profiles and bloggings and all type of blogging sites. I was so obsessive to start my own blog for Artist Newsletter that I created a whole archive of material and failed to make one entry. I relayed this sort of interpretation to Sophia of the direction I was going in, and she said that it could be seen as quite random unless I directed it more. I really did understand this, but at the time I was finding it really hard to find a personal response, and I was really fired up by Rob Lafrene making this comparison to Twitter and blogging. However, I remained determined, and Sophia said, go back and listen to the audio recollections. So I thought, like, come on, maybe I've missed something. So I spent a whole day listening to them. I made so many notes. I made like 47 pages of notes and exploded 2 biros on my hand, and I just absolutely went for it and thought, I'm not missing a thing. The audio recollections were fascinating, and just even listening to sort of Anne and Rob's memories and how they differed, because the performance was over 20 years ago, it was really interesting to hear how the sort of memory retrieved different sort of images, and they both remembered slightly different things. I was really intrigued and inspired by some of the sort of really powerful imagery that they both described. I felt compelled to reenact this as I wanted to sort of draw the whole experience closer to me. Anne and Rob both described this as this performance happening very much in the past, in a time very different to now, not a time when people are sort of consuming themselves in their everyday documentation of everyday life in Facebook. I searched the internet for images of Anne's previous performance, and there was kind of a mystical absence of any sort of imagery of her performance. And Anne had also talked about sort of not wanting cameras at certain performances that she'd done, and that made me think about sort of performance and the sacred, and also kind of like the North American Indians when they don't allow their sort of photograph to be taken in history because it would steal the soul. Anne described really sort of disliking some of the 1970s very staged photographs of performances, but it was these staged photographs that really intrigued me. I collected images of real found archival footage of Anne's past performances, and also images that were staged or theatrical that also kind of expressed some of the imagery and ideas in paintings. And I sort of looked at them both, thinking about documentation, was it sort of the truth in the artefact, or was it there to be manipulated? I was so inspired by the imagery I'd heard of, I had decided to reenact it, so I was searching for a space, and a friend said I could use his spare bedroom, so I started to sort of turn it into the Lang Gallery performance space. I listened to the sort of list of equipment and materials that Anne said she used. I found sort of an old slide projector, and also my imagination was kind of fueled by some of the things, overheard stories about the screaming and the sort of rolling around on the paintings. My sort of best art supporter friend, Matt, had said he would help me, and that he had a friend who would photograph these reenactments, as I really wanted to sort of take on the role as Anne in the photographs, sort of draw the whole experience close to myself. And when I met Matt, the other Matt, for the first time in this space, I really enjoyed this whole journey that paintings has sort of taken me on, to be here in this sort of strange space that I created with the two Matts. My friend Matt had described the other Matt Burt as an amateur photographer who was really excited about sort of engaging with an art project and sort of building on his experience. And as a kind of mutual respect to a fellow artist, I looked up his work on the internet, and I found what I thought was his blog, and it had kind of black and white images of sort of rustic buildings and sort of trips out with the kids, and I thought, that was lovely and really tasteful, and I bought, printed it out and bought it with me, and said to him, I really like your work, some of these black and white images are great. And he just cracked up, because he said that wasn't his blog, and that his sort of real speciality was photographing naked larger ladies. So I just thought that was really funny, and it broke the ice, and we really did have a great time photographing. They both had a real sort of generosity and spirit in engaging with this, and we made some really interesting images. On reflection, the photographs of the two Matts had a very sort of sinister and dark energy about them. It made me think of something Rob had said about Performance magazine being titled after an iconic film performance from the 1970s that very much dealt with a sort of dark energy in the relationship between performance and madness. The original brief had been very much about ephemeral practice being remembered and passed on, so I was really interested in this idea of me sort of continuing to collaborate with other people. So I had the opportunity, or I requested the opportunity, of working with my friend Lucy. Lucy is a fine artist and fashion photographer, and I really wanted to work with her because every photograph she takes seems to be sort of saturated in her personality and her sensibility, which was a very different energy to the Matts. When I worked with Lucy, I was really enjoying some of the subtleties that happened, the sort of slide projector tipping over and the image of the moth kind of being cast across the leg. Also, Lucy seemed very interested in the space and maybe the theatricality of the space. And also the colours. The photographs had a kind of blue cast across them, and the colours of the room with the red curtains and the blues very much sort of mirrored the paintings from the 1980s of Anne's. With Lucy, I felt like the whole sort of act of the being photographed, had become a performance. And Anne had talked about the intensity of the performance she did at the Lang that was, over an hour long. And I felt like this was sort of really incorporated in some of the photographs with Lucy that we'd taken, especially the sort of Polaroids of the kind of slump performer in the corner of the room. I really liked these sort of the objects of the Polaroids that very much looked like artefacts, especially when they sort of gathered dust. They looked like they actually could be found sort of archival footage. Just before I'd started my own reenactment, Sophia had informed me that Anne had confirmed that she would do a response to her own performance for her archival installation. The sort of original idea had been that the archive installation of the older artist would be contextual material and the recollections, but Anne had decided actually to respond to her own performance, and the sort of evidence of the reenactment that she would do would form part of that exhibition. I was really fascinated fascinated and intrigued to what Anne's own responses were going to be. But at this time I really wanted mine to be a very sort of private response, as I was really struggling to make this response personal. So I'd moved away from so much correspondence with Sophia, and I really wanted to work with these sort of recollections and my imagination only, in creating almost a kind of fictional archive. I felt like it would be very sort of complex to respond to an artist's response, and I'd already begun my own sort of personal journey. And with the photograph of Lucy, I felt like something sort of very exciting had happened, and I began to select images from this series to maybe be my final piece. I'd stuck the images all over my office and was sort of reviewing all of them, and I started to be quite excited by the idea of sort of blowing up the colour ones, the digital images becoming pixelated, maybe sort of resonating sort of the now, and then being layered with the Polaroids as very much sort of past archival footage. With very sort of blinkered enthusiasm, I made my selection and sent it off to the Lang. I'd actually missed a very important correspondence saying there was some sort of concern with this process of the images, and that when Sophia had received them, she felt that they weren't right for the group show. I thought about how these images had been received by them, and I think in light of Anne doing her own response and her own reenactment, it very much made, you know, all the energy that had gone into my process just looked like a simple reenactment to them. It made me think that maybe I really had, you know, an intense conversation with myself, as Anne had put it when I first spoke to her, and that maybe the really important thing had been the journey, and I was encouraged to make this video. When I got over the sort of initial sort of being pissed off and a bit sort of knackered by the whole project, I actually realised that they had been right, that actually what was important and interesting had been this journey and this process. And it also made me think about how, you know, they had received the images and how they were, my ideas had not been communicated well. I started to think about how they'd be received by other people, and also other people working with you on these sort of strange art intervention projects, and not necessarily your art audience, but the people who are helping you make them. I thought at this point of my dad, who had been working with me the whole way through, preparing the space and the gold frames. So feeling a bit sort of desperate that my whole project had imploded and I had to make a video sort of in the last week, I called my dad over for an emergency Asda lunch, and I thought I would capture him on video, you know, and get his response to the project and see whether sort of anything had been communicated to him well during this whole process. I have to ask you, Dad, on camera, I have to say, as you've been working with me on this project, what you think of the project?
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated. I thought it was a wonderful sort of melange of all sorts of things. I didn't really fully understand what the whole concept was really, but...
Okay, so if you had to say, I've spoken to you and told you all the way through, and it's been a bit baffling, what do you think I was actually doing when you've been helping? Tell me what the project is.
I don't know, I thought you were representing some work that one of the other artists had done. Very peculiar, some of it for me, especially the Buddha and all the rest of it. I didn't understand what was going on there with the Buddha. But I understood the photography,
yeah.
I understood the setup and the art setup and the artist working and so on, and I thought the work you put up in the little gallery came together quite well.
And now it's all gone a bit tits up, what do you think?
Now that it's all gone tits up, the best thing is to always cover your tits up.
Let's have our sandwich. Dad's had a real investment in the Buddha because he'd been given a strange instruction from me to find a mouth-sized Buddha, and he scoured the sort of charity shops for one and he couldn't find one, so in the end he took his own Buddha ornament and painted it gold. When I was in this phase of sort of thinking that this project had sort of imploded, I started to sort of wonder about the brief, and had it been too abstract for me, and the sort of fact that Anne talked about live art having this sort of idealistic communication with the audience in the 80s, and that kind of commitment wasn't so evident now. And I started to think, oh God, you know, like, am I a product of very much of this time, of compulsive Facebooking and texting, and, you know, was I one of the short attention span public who couldn't kind of commit to engaging in this sort of performance art? However, when sort of encouraged to make this video by Sophia, I started to sort of reflect more positively and thinking about that maybe my real work had been this sort of collaboration, and reviewing this process of collaboration and reenacting the whole performance twice really brought about a sort of stark difference between the two sets of photographs and the two sets of people's interpretation. I think I was unable to transform or change Anne's performance into something sort of entirely different. Maybe if I had experienced this performance personally, I would have had a different response. But, you know, the main thing I felt from this performance was just a massive sense of loss, that there was no archival material. And that's to do with my own sort of desires and my own sort of delicate psychology of why I've actually become an artist that I do sort of compulsively document. I was fascinated by Anne's response to her own performance, especially to some of the images, especially the voice images that have been so different to my interpretation of the gold Buddha in the mouth. Anne's response was full of energy, and she described it as a kind of revelationary experience for her. Whereas there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that has happened to me, reflecting the thing that Anne had first said in the interviews, that the final artwork or the painting often doesn't reflect the journey and all the energy of the experience that goes into it, which had kind of happened to me. However, unlike Anne, this has not inspired me to become a live artist. In fact, I was probably going to opt out of the next responding to a live artist performance work. I just found the brief kind of abstract, and I was just personally just exhausted by this sense of loss of no materials as an artist. I just found it really hard for me. As I archived all the footage for this video I began to make, I realised that it really reflected my response as an artist to obsessively document and sort of prolifically produce material in order to understand something. What fascinated me about Anne and the painting's performance was its spontaneity and Anne's lack of desire to control the outcome. This fascinated me artistically, but personally terrified me. Paintings had taken me on a bizarre and eventful journey, but I was relieved to be leaving it in the past.